Podcast, episode
441.
I'm Matt Dursin.
And I'm John Hunt.
Hey, Inferno.
All right, we had the opportunity to chat with one of our childhood idols, the great Buzz Dixon, writer on so many great shows from our youth. He wrote Transformers, G.I. Joe, Visionaries, and Humanoids. All these, we talk about these shows all the time in this podcast. Mr. T.
Mr. T. We talk about that show all the time.
That's right. The new Schmo. Schmoo? I don't even know what that is.
I didn't know he wrote that one too.
On his bio here on his webpage. So, Ninja Turtles, Thundarr the Barbarian.
What's a favorite?
It was a really great conversation, and we only scratched the surface, really, of his long and varied career. So, thanks, Buzz, for coming on. Make sure you check out BuzzDixon.com for all of his writings, his weekly fictoids that he posts. It was great. So here it is. Here's our interview with Buzz Dixon. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, it's great.
Yo, Joe! Great to talk with you, Buzz. Thanks so much for coming on our show. We're such big fans and such big fans of G.I. Joe and Transformers. So you really have done a lot for us over the years.
Mighty Men and Yuck, I might add.
Oh yeah. Don't leave that out.
Yeah, you did not discriminate in your career. You have written for just about everything. Like on your website here, it goes in alphabetical order. It's almost, I think just about every letter is represented, except for
pretty much, yeah.
Pretty amazing.
I'm completely indiscriminate. You
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, really, the question that's been on my mind for a while, and I think a lot of fans' minds. The most important question is, when did you shave your mustache?
Oh, it was around 2000 or so. I got a driver's license, and I looked at the picture in the driver's license, and I said, all I need is a cocked derby hat over my head, and I'll look like an Irish pub brawler. And so I said, okay, the mustache has got to go now. And so it went.
Well, that's, you can always, if you wanted to become an Irish pub brawler, you could always bring it back.
I don't know. I think I'm past my Irish pub brawling stage. my beard. I mean, the other day, with the pandemic and whatnot, you get a little lax on personal grooming, and I went like a week without shaving. And the other day, I was looking in the mirror and I go, "Wow, I've really got a thick beard." But the problem is, it's all white. You don't notice it until you're up close.
Yeah,
we can relate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, these pandemic beards, they can get out of hand a little bit.
I should do one of my wife. No, it's a joke.
I
told her that the other day. Yeah.
So I don't know. Can we start at the beginning a little bit here?
Sure.
We kind of just want to talk about your career and everything. How did you get in? How'd you get into this crazy gig?
Well, quite literally, I've got to start with getting drafted. I was drafted in 1972. I spent 6 years in the Army. I got married, which is why I spent 6 years. I stayed in, for, the health benefits and things like that. But in any case, when I was discharged in 1978, I applied to USC's film school. I was accepted, but the film school didn't start until fall. And I was released from active duty in about February of 78. So I came to Los Angeles with my wife and 3-year-old daughter, and I was hoping to get a job in some aspect of the movie industry at one of the studios or someplace, just to get my feet wet, just to have a little bit of exposure before I go to film school. So I literally started at the top, Universal, worked my way down. I was looking for a job as a driver in the mail room, a gopher, something like that.
Work your way up.
Not even work my way up, just get some experience, some real world experience before film school started. Wow. And I literally worked my way down to Filmation Studios. Filmation was about maybe 100 on the list of places that I was checking. I'm not exaggerating when I say this, by the way. I was hitting every single studio.
Wow.
In fact, before I hit Filmation, I went over to Samuel Z. Arkoff's office, and I didn't meet him, but I could hear him screaming obscenities in the phone. Yeah. So in any case, I get to Filmation Studios, And I bring my resume in to the receptionist, and I said, I'm looking for a job. And she says, well, in animation or in live action, because, Filmation did both kinds of shows. Well, I don't know anything about animation, of course. So I say, well, live action. And she says, wait a moment. And she takes my resume back. And when she comes out, she says, Arthur Nadell is our live action producer. And he would like to, he'd be happy to talk with you. You can go on back and you can speak with Arthur. So I go back. And Arthur, I got to say, he was a sweetheart. He was one of the kindest, gentlest men I've ever met. A really nice guy. But anyway, Arthur was in his office. And while I had no idea of the rhythm and flow of the animation business, I later found out I had come in the middle of what they call hiatus season. And hiatus season is a gap between the end of production on the previous season and the period where the studios, the networks rather, would start buying their new shows. And that could be, it could be up to 3 months, depending upon, the studio. And so Arthur's sitting back there with literally nothing to do. He's twiddling his thumbs. And, the receptionist comes in. There's a guy looking for work. And he goes, yeah, send him back. Anything to kill an afternoon. Well, I come back, I talk with Arthur. He asked me something about myself, and I explained, I had been in the Army, but before that I had been, involved in science fiction fandom. I was a newspaper editor and a journalist in the Army, and I had tried writing science fiction stories. And Arthur said, really? He said, I'd be happy to take a look at some if you'd like to bring them by. And you don't have to hit me over the head. So the next week I came back with a couple of the stories that I had written, and Arthur took them and he said, we've got this thing we're developing, and I'm not allowed to ask you to do any development work on it, because if I ask you, I have to pay you. But if you on your own were to want to develop a few ideas, I'd be happy to take a look at them. Well, again, you don't have to punch me over the head. So I go back, I dig my typewriter out. I mean, we literally had everything we owned packed in our car at that point. So we were, I was able to get my stories and my typewriter out of the car. So I get my typewriter. I write up about 6 or 8 ideas for this show. I bring them in the week after that to Arthur, and he says, thank you. And he says, I'll be in touch. What I didn't know was this. Arthur, when he read my short stories, had sent them to Lou Scheimer, who was one of the co-owners of Filmation Studios. He sent them to Lou by Federal Express because Lou was vacationing in Hawaii. And you've got to understand, in 1978, FedExing something overnight to Hawaii was like a really big deal.
Probably really expensive.
Yeah. So he FedExed my stories to Lou. And then when Lou came back, the premises that I had written for the show were sitting on his desk. And he called Arthur and said, Arthur, I don't know who we should hire. Should we hire the guy who wrote the short stories or the guy that wrote the premises? And Arthur said, it's the same guy. And Lou said, get him. And so Arthur calls up and says, would you like to write an episode of one of our shows? And well, again, you don't have to beat me over the head with it. That's a hell of a lot better than being in the mailroom, isn't it?
Right. I was just going to drive around.
So I write up this script. I'm trying to remember which show it was now. It may have been, it was for one of the shows that eventually was one of the segments that was eventually incorporated under the umbrella title Tarzan and the Super 7, but I can't remember exactly which segment it was. It was probably Freedom Force, if I remember correctly. But don't hold me to that, okay? In any case, I write this script. I bring it in. They accept it. And then they say, would you like to have a staff job here? Well, again, being paid to write cartoons, yeah, absolutely. I'll be happy to do that. And I was being paid enough that we were able to rent an apartment. We were able to, get our feet firmly planted in Los Angeles. And when the time came around to go to USC, I was thinking, well, I'm making a decent living right now writing cartoons. They want to keep me on through hiatus season to develop ideas for them. I'll just stay on another year and I'll go to USC's film school next year. Next year never came. I just kept getting work. And, I figured at the time, what's the point of interrupting, a winning streak?
Right.
Just keep working.
Your Filmation sort of became your film school.
It certainly did. I mean, I met a lot of people there that I interacted with and learned a lot from in the years to come. I was able to wander around the studio and talk to people and just see how the different jobs were done. One thing that worked really well for me, most writers didn't interact with the storyboard department very closely. And I went upstairs and I got to know the storyboard department and I talked with them and I, saw what they were doing. And I learned to listen and get feedback from them because they would say, when you write it this way, it's difficult for us to lay it out. When you write it another way, it's easier. And so I began finding out, well, what can these guys do really well, really easy, that looks good? And what is it that would be problematic for them that I should try to avoid?
So you were writing to their strengths.
Exactly. I mean, I learned real early on, whatever you do, don't write a guy on horseback chasing a train around a curve in a mountain. They will come looking for you with baseball bats. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And similar to like writing comics too, you don't want to kill your artist with some crazy, a stampede of horses or something like that.
Oh yeah. I mean, if whatever you can figure out doing to make their life easier. And I mean, sometimes they do like challenges. You want to give them something that'll make them stretch creatively. But well, I'll jump ahead here. I'll tell you a story that comes later, really. But
Please, no.
there was a show called Turbo Teen.
Oh, I was telling guys about this earlier.
Yeah. I'll
awesome.
tell you how I dodged the bullet on Turbo Teen when we get to that point. But in any case, I ended up, John Dorman, who I met at Filmation, was now working for Ruby Spears. And they had taken John's team out of the building that Ruby Spears was in, the main studio building. And they had moved them to a suite of offices that used to be Cheech and Chong's old offices. And I'll tell you, they never was a art team put in a more appropriate place. I mean, they were chemically enhanced. Let me just leave it at that. Okay.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so John and I were good friends. I'm going over to have lunch with John. And Turbo Teen, if you remember, it's a story about this kid who, under various circumstances, turns into a car. So I'm going over to see John. I come into the office and it's a big bullpen. And all of the storyboard artists are sitting at their desks and they're just glowering. They're just angry. And not a word is being spoken. And I figure, oh crap, they've had a big argument among themselves and they're all feuding with one another. And I stand there and nobody says anything for 90 seconds. And I know it was 90 seconds because there was a radio on and 3 commercials played and nobody said anything. And then at the 90-second mark, John Dorman goes, "God damn Joe Blow," which was the name of a writer. And they all start pounding their desks, screaming. What had happened was Joe Blow, I'm not going to mention his name, but the guy had written a script where Turbo Teen, as a car, is at a swimming pool, and he climbs up the high dive as a car, and he gets on the diving board and bounces up and down as a car, and he executes a jackknife and dives in the water as a car, and swims over to a rowboat in a swimming pool as a car, and climbs in as a car. And they were expected to animate this. So you can understand their frustration and their chemical enhancement.
It was medicinal.
It was
Literally.
medicinal. Yeah. Okay.
You took them into consideration when you were
Oh,
writing.
absolutely. Yeah.
Did that scene ever actually get animated?
I think it eventually got in there in some shape, fashion, or form.
That's
But I
amazing.
mean, yeah.
It took a lot of medicinal.
I hope it's on
Oh,
YouTube
my-
somewhere.
enhancement to get through it.
Well, you look at the stuff. Last year I had reason to look up Turbo Teen, And the stories just do not make any sense. Even for a Ruby Spears production of the era, they do not make sense. They're just
even
like
as a 8 or 9-year-old when that came on, I was like, this show is dumb. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's just like random scenes thrown together. And we'll get into the background of it. I could explain why it looked like random scenes thrown together, but we'll get there eventually. Anyway, back to Filmation. I was at Filmation. I was there a year and a half, 2 years. They let me go because they had a budget crunch one hiatus season and they couldn't keep me on. And I went looking for other work, and I wound up at Ruby Spears, where I did a couple of episodes. I don't think Mighty Man and Yuck was the first thing I did. It might have been Dingbat and the Creeps. Yeah, Dingbat and the Creeps, for those who may be listening, it was the Three Stooges as monsters, and Curly was a fat skeleton. Process that one, okay?
Wow.
Yeah.
My God.
Joe Ruby, I mean, Joe and Ken, these were two sweethearts. I mean, they were really nice guys. They were two of the best people I ever worked with.
Matt and I saw them at a panel at Comic-Con in like 2007 or 8.
Yeah.
These decent guys.
Yeah, oh my God, decent is not the word for it. I mean, they were upright. They were really good. They were mensches. I mean, they were good guys. Yeah, and the way they worked, because you have to understand, these are the guys that created Scooby-Doo. All right, and the way they worked was that Joe was the idea man, and he would just sit and spew ideas all day long, and Ken would jot them down. And Ken was the organizational guy. Ken, when the day was done, would look at all this stuff that had come spilling out of Joe's head, and he would find ways of linking it together so it made some kind of sense. And as a result, you had these very strong visual scenes, but they at least flowed together. I mean, they at least made some kind of story sense. When they ended up having their own studio, out of necessity, Ken had to be in charge of the actual production end of things. He had to make sure, the everything was delivered on time, that there weren't any production problems. And Joe had a more dominant input into what the stories were. Now, out of necessity, he had to hire writers, and they were very good. I'm not saying this to brag, but I mean, besides myself, you had Steve Gerber, you had Marty Pasco, Cheryl Scarborough, and Katie Cooch, who started out as secretaries and became writers and were really good writers at the studio. I mean, and not counting freelancers. I mean, guys like Mark Evanier and Roy Thomas.
Big names in comics and in animation.
Yeah, exactly. And so they were smart enough to hire really good writers with a good, strong story sense, and as a result, we could come up with the stuff that would incorporate the wildness that Joe wanted in the stories, but we could bring it out in a way that it made sense, that you had a strong storyline that you could follow. But it was very capricious because Joe would make changes and add things and turn things around, and as much as a sweetheart as Joe was, when he set his mind on something, it was in there, and no amount of logic, no amount of pointing out to him why it would not work that way would help you. I spent 15 minutes on Turbo Teen, and the reason I spent 15 minutes on it, this will overlap slightly with the Transformer portion of the discussion, so forgive me for being disjointed, but
no, we'll get there. It's okay.
That's how we roll.
Yeah.
We had Flint Dilly on a couple of months ago, and that was all over the place. So this seems much more linear in comparison.
Exactly. Well, Flint was there too. Flint didn't start at the same time I started. Flint eventually came on. So yeah, I met Flint at Ruby Spears.
He said of you that you make him look positively catatonic in comparison.
Anyway, I had been known in the industry as the giant robot bug at that point, because early on, when I was aware of giant robots in Japanese culture long before most people were. I mean, there was a magazine called Famous Monsters, and briefly they had a companion magazine called Spacemen, which was about science fiction movies exclusively, not just monster movies. And the very first giant robot I saw was in the pages of this. There was a Japanese live action giant robot show called Dai Tetsujin 17, which means Big Iron Man 17. And it, I was going, wow, yeah, that's a great idea. In fact, even before that, there's a French animated film that was shown in serial form on American cartoon shows under the title The Adventures of Mr. Wonderbird. And it's a great film. It's the best way to describe it is it's a cross of Hans Christian Andersen and Fritz Lang's Metropolis. I mean, it's a really bizarre, interesting film. You can find it on YouTube. Track it down, take a look. But the villainous king in it has this giant robot that, stomps through the city, oppressing people in it. And so as a little kid, I saw this on TV. And so giant robots. Okay, this connects in Buzz Dixon's brain here. So I had been preaching the giant robot gospel to every animation studio that I worked at. And I said, this is going to be the next big thing. This wave is about to come in from Japan because they had already had the Shogun Warrior toys introduced. I said, you have got to get ahead of it. If you can develop a giant robot show, you'll be ahead of the big wave and you'll enjoy huge profits. And everybody just blew me off. Oh. Well, Joe calls all the writers in and all the art people in for a meeting, and it's with the Hasbro people. And the Hasbro people open up this big briefcase, and it is filled with Transformer toys from Japan. And they had bought the rights to like 3 or 4 different licenses. And what they were going to do was they were going to eliminate the human pilots in the vehicles, because by eliminating the human pilots, they can make the toys 20 to 30 cents cheaper in the United States. And they were going to make them autonomous robots. And they wanted to do a series they were going to call Transformers, and it was going to be giant transforming robots fighting one another. And I'm in the room just biting my lip, trying not to have an orgasm on the spot, And the moment they left, I go to Joe and I say, Joe, you have got to develop the show. You have got to sign on. Trust me, this is going to be huge. This is going to be great. It's going to be giant. And Joe goes, nah, I got a better idea. We're going to do a show about a teenage boy who turns into a car. And I said, and then the car turns into a parking lot? Because I thought he was joking. And no, he wasn't joking. So they developed Turbo Teen. And, I forget who did the development. But in any case, when the Bible was complete, they call us in. They describe the show to us. They hand us all the Bible. And they say, now go back to your offices and develop some story ideas. So I go back to my office. I get about halfway through the Bible. I chuck it in the trash can. I go to Joe and I say, Joe, I'll work on the show, but you got to explain a few things to me first. If the kid is a car and they take his wheels off, if he turns back into a kid, is he missing his hands and feet? If the kid is a car and they take the battery out, if he turns back into a kid, is he missing his heart? If the kid is a car and they put a suitcase in his trunk and Joe says, I am putting you on another show. Minutes on Turbo.
Can you talk about the development of Cubert cartoon? Because I had forgotten about that. And I listened to an interview with you recently where you described that. And I was like, that sounded amazing. And what it turned into was just, what?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. My God. I was one of the other writers we had. There was a guy named Gary Greenfield. Gary doesn't get the credit he deserves because Gary was such a soft-spoken, low-key guy, and he was hilarious. I mean, he wrote very funny scripts, but he was the kind of guy that you would talk to him, and he's just he's an average Joe when you talk to him, and then you find out he's creative genius. But anyway, Joe was developing a bunch of different video game ideas. It was going to be Saturday Morning Starcade or something like that. And he gave Gary and me the task of developing Cubert as a segment. So we look at Cubert and we think to ourselves, well, what is this show about, really? And it dawned on us that what it was a 4-dimensional version of the Coyote and Roadrunner. That Cubert is the Roadrunner, the snakes are the equivalent of the Coyote, and what makes it different is that in the blink of an eye, the orientation can change. Everything can change. And all of a sudden, what seemed to be the floor is now the ceiling. What was one wall is now a different wall. And so we said, well, we got to approach it that way. So we started working on just this bizarre 4-dimensional world that Cubert and the snakes would inhabit, and all the crazy gags that we could do with it. And we came up with, because we recognized we've got to come up with a number of ideas, viable ideas, to show that this can work as a series. And we came up with about a dozen ideas for episodes. We came up with at least 20 different gags that you could use using, the orientation of the screen changing and all this stuff. And really, both of us felt very happy and very proud with it. And we take it into Joe. And again, literally, Joe takes this without even opening it, tosses it unread in the garbage can, and says, literally, right in front of us, throws it in the garbage can and says, I want to do Cubert as Happy Days. God's sakes, why?
The weirdest thing ever.
Yeah, arguably at the time, the most unique concept in video games. Why would you want to take that and try to force it into another mold? But that's what he wanted, And ultimately, because his name was on the studio and the paychecks, he got what he wanted.
Of course.
But none of this was to appease the video game makers or toy manufacturers or anything. It sounds like at this studio. It's just this is my idea.
Yeah. Well, I felt bad for Joe and Ken because they had a couple of hits and they weren't able, for a variety of reasons, to build on them. And the reasons they weren't able to build on them had nothing to do with the actual shows themselves. It had everything to do with network strategy. We had Thundarr. Thundarr was a good hit for us. It was very successful. The network
talk about that for a minute, but please go ahead. Yeah, I mean,
they just got a little antsy about the violence in it, and so they decided, well, let's go with something that isn't quite as violent. We had another show we did called The Puppy's New Adventures, which was based on a couple of weekend specials that they had done. And The Puppy's New Adventures, they were your generic, good for little kid, puppy adventures. That's all they were. But we weren't writing tongue in cheek. We weren't writing snark. We were going, okay, this is for a 6 to 8 year old market. Keep that in mind. Make the stories on that level, but make it interesting for the kids. And we did a good job. It was I think the highest rated series that Joe and Ken ever had. Network decided they had enough of them. They didn't want to do anymore, and that happened to them repeatedly. Missing the boat with Transformers. They eventually got into the syndicated market way at the end of the game. And the show that they did, and I can't remember the title right now, but the last series they did, beautiful. I mean, it just looks great. It's gorgeous.
The Centurions.
Yeah.
It had Jack Kirby and Gil Kane working on that show.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah. It beautiful show, but I mean, it came for them too late in the cycle because at that point it was becoming overcrowded. I mean, it was, everywhere you turned around, somebody had a 52 episode series they were trying to promote, or 65 episode series, excuse me, not 52. They missed opportunities. Joe and Ken, after they created Scooby-Doo, they lasted one more year at Hanna-Barbera, and then they were forced out because Joe Barbera wasn't about to have, another pair of creative geniuses undermining him at the studio.
I heard that about about Hanna-Barbera, like with Johnny Quest and things like that. They would take all the credit for it when Doug Wily was really the brains behind it.
Yeah. I mean, no, that frequently happened. The story about how they sold Scooby-Doo, because they had pitched it to Joe Barbera, and Joe Barbera shot it down. And then Fred Silverman, and I forget if he was at ABC or NBC at the time, but he was still the children's programming person, whichever network he was at. Fred Silverman comes in for a pitch session, and the pitch session is when the studio is presenting their various ideas. And typically the studio will have the chief designer and the creative people present to answer questions that the studio might have, or the network might have, I should say, excuse me. So Joe and Ken are in on this meeting because they're pitching a bunch of stuff. And what Joe Barbera would do would be to start with a stack of artwork at the end of the table. And he'd show the idea that he wants to sell the most first. And if the network passes, he flips it down to the next one. And he just keeps going until he finally gets to one that the network will buy. And then he stops, which is the smart thing to do. You don't want to undo a sale. Well, this time, Joe Barbera goes through, and Silverman doesn't buy anything. He just rejects all the ideas, right off the bat. And Joe Barbera says, well, tell you what, give us a couple of weeks and we'll have some other ideas for you. And Silverman looks at Joe and Ken because he had, he knew who they were in the studio, in the hierarchy. And he said, what about you guys? Have you guys got any ideas? And Ken told me, he said, we knew at that moment our careers at H&B were over, because, you're just not going to be allowed to have that kind of power, in the system. And so we just rolled the dice and we said, yeah, we've got this show. And they pitched what was later titled Scooby-Doo. They didn't pitch. I think they pitched it as the Mystery Machine, but it doesn't matter. They pitched what became Scooby-Doo, and Silverman goes, great, I'll take that. And so now Joe Barbera is over a barrel. He's just made a sale that he has no control over. He can't fire Joe and Ken because they're clearly the fair-haired boys on this project. Mm-hmm. But the next year, boom, they're out the door, because, once they had the show locked in, they could get rid of them and they could replace them with other writers. So Joe and Ken were cut loose, and Silverman, who by this time, I can't remember where Silverman was, but essentially what happened was Joe and Ken were recruited to be troubleshooting story editors for primetime live action shows. And they were bounced around from show to show. Whenever a network would have a show that was in trouble, they'd plug Joe and Ken in. Joe and Ken would get it, would address whatever problems there were and try to get the show back on course. One of the shows that they were put on was the Planet of the Apes TV series. And the Planet of the Apes TV series, the problem that they had was that the producers of the TV show, their previous show had been Medical Center, okay, which is a big hospital drama. Mm-hmm. And it's like there's an inordinate number of Planet of the Apes episodes about monkeys with diseases, okay? And
by coincidence.
And yeah. And Joe and Ken are looking at it and say, no. These are apes. We got to do a lot of stuff with them. We got to have action. And they actually came up with an idea that would have been a precursor to Die Hard. And the idea was that they would find a skyscraper buried up to the top floor in muck and debris, but the skyscraper has a nuclear generator and can maintain itself. The inside is pristine, but the outside is buried under all this dirt and debris. And the human heroes and the apes get inside the skyscraper, and basically they're chasing each other up and down the staircases. They're going down the elevator shafts. They're doing all this stuff. It's Die Hard before Die Hard.
Die Hard with primates.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, come on. Tell me you would not watch an episode.
I'm already imagining how awesome.
And the producers shot him down. They said, "Oh, no. We don't want to do that. We don't want to do that." And well, that's why Planet of the Apes, the live action series, faded after one season.
Diseases.
Yeah.
Apes with diseases.
So when Ken told me this later when I was working for him, I'm listening to it and I'm going, Ken, you realize they were grooming you to be live action producers. They saw and liked what you guys did, and they wanted you to be doing it in live action on primetime. Why did you end up here? And he said, Joe and I just loved animation. We wanted to do animation. We didn't want to do primetime. And I kind of like smacked my forehead. I like animation too, but if somebody came and dangled producing live action TV,
they wouldn't have to hit you over the head with a shovel.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, they chose animation. They willfully chose animation, and they gave it their best shot. I mean, they were conscientious. They worked hard, but events conspired against them. What can I say?
Yeah. Well, you touched on Thundarr the Barbarian really quick. I just want to mention on your website, you have a post called Thundarr the Movie or How I Almost Created Kickstarter.
Yeah.
Which I found pretty interesting. Do you want to elaborate on?
I'll start with that, and then I'll work back to the origins of how I got involved with Thundarr.
However you want to do it.
Well, basically, as the Saturday morning industry was drying up, because between syndication and sports television crowding them out, and the Reagan era FCC saying there no longer had to be dedicated blocks of children's programming, the opportunities to do Saturday morning animation dried up very, very quickly. And Joe and Ken were looking for any number of ideas that they could ride, into some other business. One of the ideas was to try to develop feature films that would be shown in theaters. Most of them were of a comedy nature. They developed one that was going to be really funny called Rip Off, and the concept was to just literally rip off every movie done the previous year. And just, like Burt Reynolds is, flying the Millennium Falcon. It was supposed to be a comedy, obviously.
Like a Naked Gun
and the joke was just mash up everything that had been done in the previous year. And you could do it every year then, because then every year you've got a brand new rip-off movie that, makes fun of the previous years. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Same idea, only for the entire, film, not just
like we could use that now since they're not around anymore, right?
Yeah.
Try to develop that on our own.
Yeah,
right.
So that was one idea, and the other one was to do a Thundarr movie. And I developed a outline for them that would have been the origin of Thundarr, how he and Ookla and Ariel, met, roughly the way they meet. I mean, they're they both, Thundarr and Ookla have both been enslaved by Ariel's father, and they form an alliance to escape. Ariel also wants to get away from her father because she realizes he's bad news, and so she helps them escape, but they've got to help her. So it's a mashup. I mean, again, I was kind of anticipating the movie Solo, but it was
that's
also
exactly
kind of
what I was just thinking about.
Yeah. It was a mashup of Solo and basic Star Wars stuff. So it was not that outrageous. And we had a lot of Star Wars influence in Thundarr, the TV show. But in any case, we developed the idea, and they couldn't get any traction on it. And I said to Ken, how much do we really need to raise to get this in production? And I forget what the figure was, but it was not an outrageous number. It was something like, I'm gonna draw a number out of a hat. If it wasn't this exactly, it was in the ballpark, $7 million, which even at that time was not an outrageous amount of money. And I said, well, is there any way we can raise the money for it? And he said, well, how? And I said, well, you got all these fans of the show. Tell the fans if they'll buy the tickets in advance, we'll make the movie. And Ken laughs at me, and I said, no, really, seriously, do it. Just have like it's a coupon, and they have them send in $5, and they get to see the movie for free when the movie comes out. And he says, yeah, how are you going to convince theaters to run the movie then? And I said, they will love this, because the $5 they're not spending to see the movie is $5 that are going to be spent at the concession stand.
Yeah, that's how theaters make all the money anyway.
So. Exactly. Yeah. I said, you can do this. And he thought about it, nah, it's not going to work. So I basically had the idea for Kickstarter, long before Kickstarter.
Like 1983 or 4 or whatever.
Yeah. Before I went to...
I call it kickfunder.com.
Yeah. Yeah. This would have been before I went to G.I. Joe. So yeah, 83, 84, somewhere around there.
I mean, well, good segue. Now maybe we can move on to G.I. Joe a little bit.
Yeah.
If you want to.
I have a question about G.I. Joe. Now, your time in the military, you said, was spent in journalism and writing. How did just being in the military affect you writing these military characters when it came your way?
Well, by that time, for a variety of reasons, the Ruby Spears writing staff had split to the 4 winds. No fault of Joe or Ken's, but a person who was in mid-level management managed to come in one day and just alienate every single writer in about the blink of an eye. And within 15 minutes, every writer was on the phone with their agent saying, get me a new gig. And they lost 80% of their writing staff within a 2-week time period. Because of this. Yeah. And again, Joe and Ken were not aware of this until long after it happened. And when they found out what had happened and who was responsible, they took the person out to lunch. The person thought they were getting their contract renegotiated. And while they were out to lunch, they boxed up everything in the person's office, changed the locks, and for dessert, they told the person, by the way, you're fired. And,
what the hell?
So technically, they did renegotiate.
But yeah, you don't destroy the creative staff at a studio and get to stay on. But anyway, so we had all kind of scattered, and Steve Gerber had wound up at Hasbro because Steve had worked with Marvel Comics. Hasbro was working with Marvel Comics, the comic books for G.I. Joe and Transformers. They had done a series of commercials for the comic books on TV. And I remember seeing the commercials and thinking, wow, if they could do an animated show that looks like this, it'll be a huge hit,
Yeah. They were very cool commercials.
Yeah.
I remember those.
Yeah. Now I have to explain something so you can understand the gestalt of the era. There had been in the 60s a show called Hot Wheels. And it was a good show, but the problem was it was pushing the Hot Wheels toys. And a parents group at the time complained to the FCC that it was just a half-hour commercial. The FCC looked at it, agreed, and they passed a ruling that said you could not do a toy-based show for kids.
Man.
The caveat was if you had something that had started as a non-toy item, as a comic book, as a novel, as a movie, and then became a toy, then you could base your show on that, but you couldn't start with a toy.
Loopholes.
Okay? Yeah, loopholes. Well, the first one, it will not surprise you in the slightest to know Hanna-Barbera was the first ones to exploit this loophole. Because Hanna-Barbera, they saw the Smurf trinkets were everywhere at this time. They were hugely popular. And they were wondering, wow, is there any way we can make a show out of this? How can we dodge the FCC ruling? And somebody pointed out to him, well, it's based on a Belgian comic book. Oh, really? So they put the Smurfs into production, And sure enough, the FCC comes calling and says, "Hey, you can't do that. It's a toy." And they said, "Oh, no. Look, we're basing it not on the toys, but on the original Belgian comic book,
Yeah,
which has never been
signed.
translated, never been translated or published in the United States at this point." And the FCC goes, "Well, okay," and they checked off on it. Well, at this point, the FCC, I mean, at this point, the people who own the Strawberry Shortcake licensing line, they start making the Strawberry Shortcake specials. And again, the FCC says, you can't do that because they're based on toys. And said, no. It was a line of printed greeting cards.
Really stretchy.
And they go, yeah, okay, all right, fine. Printed greeting cards count. And so they were able to do their shows. Well, at this point, Mattel calls up DC and says, "We want to commission a comic book from you about a character called He-Man. We don't care what's in it because we're only going to fund it for 3 issues, but we need to have it out before we announce the toy." And okay, DC does this. It bears no resemblance other than the title, but that was all they needed. Hasbro figures out, well, we better have a comic book before we actually drop these toys into production. And so they make a deal with Marvel to do Transformers and G.I. Joe comic books that supposedly the series are based on. So by the time all this works its way through, the writing staff at Ruby Spears is scattered to the winds, but several of them have wound up at Hasbro, including, as I said, Steve Gerber, because Steve Gerber's connection to Marvel made him more acceptable to Hasbro. And Steve and I were friends. We had met at Ruby Spears and became very good friends. So I was not one of the first round of writers that they approved to write for the show. They had a kind of quiet, cattle call, and they had selected the writers that they wanted to work on the show. And I found out about it after they had already booked everybody that they wanted to have on the show. Steve said, second season, maybe we can work you in as a freelancer. And I said, all right. He said, but would you mind taking a look at a couple of the episodes and a couple of the scripts and just giving us some feedback? Well, if you remember the original miniseries that Ron Friedman wrote, and Ron is a great writer, but military accuracy is not his specialty. Okay, he's good with character, he's good with dialogue, and basically in his show, he's got tanks being cut in half by jet airplanes that swoop down and slice them with their wingtips and all kinds of stuff like this. He's got sergeants giving orders to colonels and all sorts of things.
Wasn't he in the military too, though?
He was, yeah. But I mean, he just kind of.
I guess he just didn't pay attention when he was there. Yeah. He
Yeah.
started giving orders to people, and
Yeah.
Right.
In any case, or maybe it was just a fresher memory in my mind at that point because it was like, it hadn't even been 10 years previously for me. But in any case, he, I looked at the stuff that Steve sent me and I gave him some feedback, and I basically pointed out they're not acting the way that people in the military act. There's a certain rhythm and protocol to the way you do things. And none of these characters are acting like they're in a military unit. They're just, a bunch of guys running around yelling stuff and suddenly jumping on vehicles. And so Steve thanked me. And he contacted Hasbro and said, look, Buzz was in the Army for 6 years. He knows a little bit about this kind of stuff, the protocol. Larry Hama was in the military for several years. So he's writing the Joe books with a much stronger eye to the military. We ought to bring Buzz on at the very least as a consultant to, make sure that we don't go too far afield. And they said, well, there's no room in the budget for a consultant, but I guess we could afford another writer. So I ended up coming on board as one of the writers.
Awesome.
And I was really functioning from the very beginning as an unofficial assistant story editor, just basically making sure nobody went too far afield. And as they became more confident in what I was doing, I ended up becoming an official assistant story editor. And then, of course, I was story editing the entire second season of the show. So I wasn't one of their first choices, but I don't think I'm exaggerating to say that I was one of their vital choices.
Well, I would say so because, I mean, like what Larry Hama and what you did, like those are the voices of the characters, and I understand that I don't know, you decided with Hasbro, or I heard that they were kept in separate buckets, but still somehow there's a lot of similarities. I think maybe the accuracy to the military stuff coming from you and from Larry was just making like kind of like good coincidences between the characters as they came over, or Hasbro had to approve it. I don't know.
Well, that's fairly what happened. Yeah. I mean, I think both Larry and my backgrounds with the military certainly shaped the stories in that direction. Larry made a very conscious decision early on not to watch the TV show because he recognized it would be madness to try to sync up the two.
Right.
The way you have to look at it is you've got two parallel universes where G.I. Joe and Cobra are fighting. And Larry's is one parallel universe, and we're the other parallel universe. Conversely, we had the same reaction. Larry's a great writer. I mean, Larry and I are friends. He's just a tremendous writer. But we recognized what Larry can do in a comic book, we can't do in the show. And conversely, if Larry had to pull his punches the way in the comics that we did in the show, it would have negatively affected the stories he was trying to tell. So we basically said, good for Larry, let him keep writing the way he wants to do it. We're going to keep doing it the way that we're doing it, and never the twain shall meet. And it's not a we're better, they're better. It's not that at all. It's just two different sets of It's like trying to compare the Batman 1966 series with a Dark Knight series. Same character, two different approaches. Okay, so you just recognize that, and you don't try to reconcile the two.
Yeah, it seems like a good idea. And I don't know, did G.I. Joe lead to Transformers, or did you sort of...
Transformers, if I remember correctly, and I'm not going to swear to this because obviously I wasn't in the room at Hasbro when decisions were being made. G.I. Joe as a brand preceded Transformers by 20 some years. They created G.I. Joe. G.I. Joe was essentially Barbie for boys. Okay.
Right. Yeah. And it's older.
Yeah. And in fact, my father wouldn't let me have a G.I. Joe when they came out because that's a doll. Yeah. And that was Hasbro's genius. They realized that one of the impediments to the sales, as popular as G.I. Joe had been, one of the impediments to the sales was it was a big toy that required an adult to buy it for a kid because, it was typically too expensive for a kid to buy on his own, the 12-foot tall one I'm talking about. It looked too much like a doll for some adults, for some parents to feel comfortable with their son having one. But when you shrink them down to 3.5 inches and you don't have any clothes that come on and off, maybe a helmet, maybe a backpack, then it's an action figure. Then it's okay. And when they changed them to action figures instead of the 12-inch tall ones, that's when the brand really took off.
And those action figures could move a lot. They didn't look like even the Star Wars toys. You can move the wrists, you can move the arms, you can do something special with them, which was kind of like an ode to the specialization of the original G.I. Joe toys.
Oh yeah. There are guys on Instagram who are doing tableaus with their G.I. Joe figures, and I mean, stuff is really good. I mean, photography, staging, and you can pose the figures so they look lifelike. They're doing things that actual bodies can do instead of, as you say, with the original Star Wars, the arm is up, the arm is down. There's your range. But anyway, they came up with, I don't know which preceded the other, but they glommed on to the Transformers. They separated the Transformers toys from their anime counterparts in Japan and created brand new identities for the Transformer toys. And they mixed and matched, like I said, 3 or 4 different licenses. So people who are in the know will tell you, well, this is, this is a Macross. This is
scales
exactly.
wonky.
Exactly. Yeah. And then later, of course, once they were successful, they were able to start designing their own. But it started with Japanese toys. And they did the G.I. Joe comic book and the Transformers comic book to basically get the footprint down that, oh yeah, this was a comic book before it was a toy. Wink, wink.
I
nudge,
love this
nudge.
part of the story that you're telling us because
Yeah.
that totally changes my perspective on the whole thing. So crazy.
Yeah. And about that time, there were so many Japanese imports starting to come in anime, and there was such an amount of pressure to get more of these things on the air that the FCC at the time just said, you know what, when there were only 3 networks, it made sense to require blocks of time for children's programming. It made sense to say no half-hour commercials. Now with cable and everything else, those rules are out. Well,
never mind.
Yeah, never mind. Well, the moment they said you don't have to do kids programming vanished on networks. It was replaced by sports programming, which was much more profitable. The syndication market immediately filled up with toy-based properties. If it wasn't a toy, it was with a name, brand that was looking to make toys, and they needed an animated series. What's their name? Siegfried and Roy. There was a mini series that they did, trying to see if they could get interest because they were they wanted to do a toy line with Siegfried and Roy. That's amazing. And if they could have gotten that up and running, they would have done it.
Why not? Mr. T had a show, right?
That's right.
Oh my God!
You worked on that show.
I worked on that show. That was. We're jumping back to Ruby Spears now.
It's okay.
We had 17 characters. Yeah, we had 17 characters on the show, and by network fiat, every character had to have at least one line of dialogue, including the dog, in every episode. And by the time every character got their one line of dialogue in, the show's over. So it was basically Scooby-Doo, where Mr. T was Mr. T, and the rest of them were all the various Scooby-Doo characters sliced up into smaller and smaller bits.
They had my eyeballs on it. I watched that show every time it was on.
Yeah, that show, actually, I made more money in residuals off of that show than any other show I worked on.
Whoa.
Because the live action wraparounds were under Writers Guild jurisdiction. And as a result, every time the show got reshown, I got a Writers Guild check, for residuals for that. Now, the way animation worked at that time, it was considered work for hire. You came in, you got paid for the script, and that was it. It didn't matter how many times they reshowed it. You only got paid the one time. And Europe and South America had laws that required studios and distributors to pay the creative people on a show. And so the way they did it was they had a tax. They had a tax on videotape, and they would put this tax on the videotape, blank videotapes, and then they would figure out how many shows were shown in a certain period of time in that tax period, and which percentage of total time was that show on. And then they would figure out, in that case, Mr. T aired 5 times, and it represents 1/1000th of the total audience. And we're assuming that everybody who bought a videotape, the videotapes, they were recording the shows. So 1/1000th of the tax of the videotape is due to the creative people.
Wow.
And they would send the money. They would send the money to the Writers Guild. And the Writers Guild were like, well, what do you expect us to do with it? And they said, we don't care. You are the Writers Guild of America. These are the creators. By law, by our law, they are entitled to this money. We don't care what you do with it. Well, the Writers Guild luckily has, enough common sense to go, well, even though we don't represent animation writers, we got to track them down and we got to pay them. So depending upon, what's popular or not popular, I could have gotten a couple of $100 to, 13 cents. I've actually got in my office a framed Writers Guild check for 13 cents from Space. It aired one time, and okay, I'm not going to object. Here, I'll take the money. Put it up on the wall, but not. In any case,
it costs more to print that check than
that's what artists get from Spotify now.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, if you've done a lot and it is consistently reshown or replayed, it's called the long tail. That will work for you. That will pay off for you in the long run. But that also requires a lot of material. You've got to be constantly generating stuff. Anyway, the Writers Guild, the live action portion of Mr. T was covered by the Writers Guild because it involved, an actual actor, not a cartoon character. And we were paid Writers Guild rates for like 3 minutes of live action. And then every time the show was reshown, we got Writers Guild residual rates. So I ended up making twice as much money off of the 3 minutes of live action than I did for the entire animated portion.
Hey, whatever works.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
What a great system.
Yeah.
So, if I can go back to run quick, because I was talking about how you're credited with 3 Transformers episodes, and one of them I kind of just want to touch, the Carnage in C minor. It's got to be the most bizarre episode of the whole series. Well, I don't know. Are you into music? Where did the inspiration for that even come from?
Well, it comes from a thing I developed for animation that never got anywhere. As I told you, in hiatus season, if they could keep the creative staff around, they would just send the creative staff to just generate ideas, and basically it was to keep them busy. They weren't really interested in any ideas that we cooked up at that time. And my first hiatus season at Filmation, I came up with this idea called Disco Dinosaur, which gives you an idea of just how old, The idea would be that it was a dinosaur that was a Tyrannosaurus that was a DJ and was playing music, but would also have a guitar that if he hit a certain note, the note would come out and it would do something. So, the idea was that, if you needed to, blast a hole in the wall to escape or something like that, clang, you hit the note and, blast a hole in the wall. And so that was the idea that I came up with. And, Lou Scheimer, God bless him, just, yeah, right, Buzz, get out of here. It went into this big stockpile of unused Filmation ideas. I mean, just literally they had reams and reams of ideas that had been developed and no human eye ever saw them except the person who typed them. But anyway, that was the origin of it. And I'm pretty sure the set of circumstances was something along the line of, we need another script next week. Has anybody got an idea? And I said, hey, how about this? And they said, fine, write it up. And I apparently had enough time at that moment to knock out a script fairly quickly, and so I did.
I really wish you had incorporated the dinosaur with a guitar into it. It would have made it just amazing.
Next season we could have done it, but you grab whatever you can grab. We did another one, the one with the big game hunter.
Yeah.
And I had pitched a series to CBS that actually went briefly into development, and then they didn't follow through on it. It was going to be called Dinosaur Hunters. And the concept was that a base had been set up in prehistoric times just before the impact of the asteroid that wiped out all life on Earth. And it is set up in the area where the asteroid is going to hit, because that way they know all life in that area gets wiped out. So they're not affecting history by capturing dinosaurs there and transporting them into the future. They're basically populating an animal park in the future with dinosaurs by traveling back in time. And so they had this fort. I called it Fort Night because it was both a pun on Fortnite, which is a period of time, but also Charles Knight, the dinosaur illustrator, the dinosaur painter from the early 20th century.
Oh yeah.
And again, we were going to have giant robots. That was the pitch. It was going to be giant robots versus dinosaurs. And these guys are going out wrestling dinosaurs and capturing them and bringing them back. Well, one of the stories that I wanted to do was about a big game hunter who didn't want to capture a dinosaur. He wanted to shoot one. And it's like, no, we're not here to kill. We're here to preserve life. And, what happens to him then? Well, as I said, the series went nowhere. And when at the time, again, when they needed something, I think Flint had an idea, but he only had like about half an idea. He needed something to add to it to make it work. And I said, well, I did this thing with the big game hunter, and the big game hunter looking for Optimus Prime. That would be a good, idea. And so we co-wrote that episode. And the other one,
Astro Train,
the God Gambit.
The God Gambit,
yeah.
Yes. That's right.
Yeah, I'm a Christian, and I get really offended by televangelists who are quite clearly con men, who are
the worst.
ripping people off. Yeah, and it really offends my delicate sensibilities. Let's just say that. And you can't. This is the thing that Rod Serling discovered with the Twilight Zone. If you try to write a contemporary story about politics or religion, you are going to run into a brick wall almost immediately from timid people at the network who don't want to hear about it. I mean, I'll show you how timid they are. We were doing an episode at Filmation, and the heroes need to translate a Latin inscription. And I said, well, why don't they just pop down to the nearest Catholic church and ask the priest to translate it for them? Oh, we can't do that. We can't mention churches. We're not endorsing a religion. It's a known fact. Catholic priests know Latin. You could go and knock on the door and say, excuse me, could you translate this for us? And they'd be happy to translate it for you. No, I can't do it. So we came up with something else instead of a priest translating it. They wouldn't even let us put crosses in graveyards.
Right. I think I heard you mention that in another interview.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting. No crosses.
Yeah.
And who is that going to offend? Honestly,
I don't know. It could offend both the Christians and the atheists. I don't know.
Wow.
When I was at Filmation, man, I got to tell you this: Filmation was a flipping mortar magnet for lawsuits. They got sued by everybody. Scott Shaw sued them over ripping off his Vampire Duck character. We got sued by both Marvel and DC for the same characters. Both of them claimed we were ripping off their characters. And I told Lou, I said, Lou, just tell Marvel and DC to figure out which one is getting ripped off and then just deal with that one. Because, and he lost to both of them. That was the crazy thing. He loses to both of them.
That's insane.
Oh, and the wildest one was this. There was a comic strip called Tumbleweeds, which was design-wise, it was clearly in the camp of Peanuts. I mean, that rough type of design. But it was a parody of Westerns. Every Western trope you could imagine got sent up in this. And it was a very, very funny strip. It was done by a guy named T.K. Ryan. I was a huge fan of this, okay? Big fan. And when Filmation was doing a series called The Fabulous Funnies, they said, we've got Tumbleweeds. And I want to do those. Give me the Tumbleweeds. I'll write all the Tumbleweeds for you because I love that strip. So I wrote 2 episodes. I had 2 more in the works. And the first episode aired, the first day that the premiere episode had a Tumbleweed segment in it. And the following Monday, we get a phone call from T.K. Ryan's lawyer. And T.K. Ryan's lawyer said, your lawyer came and contacted T.K. and asked if you could do a Tumbleweeds segment. And he said, let me see a storyboard so I know what you're going to do with the characters. And if I like it, I'll say yes. And you never showed us a storyboard and you never got a contract with us.
Wow.
So zing, it got yanked off the schedule. I mean, off of the rotation. In the show stayed on the air, but the segment got yanked out. And, broke my heart because I really liked Tumbleweeds. I was looking forward to doing, the episodes. But that was the way they were. They were kind of slapdash in the legal department.
Interesting.
Yeah.
They had a young Rudy Giuliani as their lawyer.
Oh, geez. Yeah. Oh, my God. Yeah. And Lou was a kind and compassionate guy. And he wouldn't cut people loose, even though it was pretty obvious, this person should not be cut loose. We had a color director who was in charge of designing the color schemes for the shows. I'm blanking on his name.
Hal Sutherland?
No, not Hal Sutherland.
Okay, I remember him being colorblind. And
yeah, no, he may have been colorblind, but there was another guy who was colorblind as well. And I'm trying to remember the other guy's name, but he was colorblind, and he designed all the characters, and that's why the characters were all purple and green. And I would write scripts that I would underline. These characters are not purple and green. Whatever colors they are not purple and green. And they'd come back purple and green, And you go, for heaven's sakes, give him a job doing something else. No, he's been used to doing it. And, it would be insulting to remove him. And, nobody ever had a problem removing.
Oh, man. It seems like just a crazy time between talking to you and talking to Flint and reading his book and everything too. It really was just what a time to be in that field. We want to talk a little bit because we're big, obviously, G.I. Joe, the movie fans and mm-hmm. Arise, Sprinter Arise you were involved with, but also the Lost episode is something that I was very intrigued about. The sort of Lost Cobra origin episode.
Yeah, well, it's a bit of a tale. I'll start by saying we had a writer named Tom Dagenet who had written a freelance script, had been paid for a freelance script for season 1, and then he was stricken with cancer. And, we recognized, for heaven's sakes, don't worry about it, Tom. Just, take the money. We'll absorb it. Don't worry. But Tom had enough sense of he was a professional enough that as soon as he recovered from chemotherapy enough to finish the script, he finished the script. But of course, by then season 1 was done. We were starting season 2, and he came in, brave guy. He came in. I mean, I'm not being facetious when I said he looked like death warmed over. But he came in and delivered the script, and I thanked him. I said, "Yeah, we'll put it in the hopper. We'll do it as a second season episode." A couple of weeks later, he passed away because it was just the cancer was too much for him. But I took the second season script. I went over it, made what few changes needed to be made because we had added or changed things from the previous season. Not a big deal to do. And in the same time, I had pitched an idea that I was going to call the most dangerous man in the world, which was essentially this idea about the Frederick Nietzsche or the Karl Marx of Cobra, the guy who came up with the idea for Cobra. But because Cobra Commander had so badly changed everything, had to be kept imprisoned because otherwise he'd be blowing the whistle on him. And I remember sending Tom's script in and talking at the same time with Hasbro about this idea, the most dangerous man in the world. And they said, yeah, just make sure both in Tom's script and in what you're doing that you include the Cobra Emperor. And I said, the Cobra who? And I said, the Cobra Emperor. And I said, well, who's the Cobra Emperor? And they said, well, he's the guy who runs Cobra. And I said, no, he's not. I said, we've just spent an entire season telling everybody that Cobra Commander is the supreme commander of Cobra. You can't just drop somebody above him without explanation. If you had told us, we could have dropped hints that there was somebody above him all the way through the series. But, we were operating that he was it. So we got to explain where this new guy comes from. And they go, you're right. Come up with a couple of ideas. So now this is the advice I give to young writers. If a producer asks you to come up with a couple of ideas, only present the idea you want to do. Because if these guys could come up with their own ideas, they wouldn't be hiring you. Okay.
Makes sense.
So I look at it and I figure, well, there's only two possible origins here. He is either raised up from within Cobra, a choice Cobra makes to replace Cobra Commander, or conversely, he has been hidden in the background all this time, and his existence, while known to Cobra Commander, has been hidden from the rest of Cobra. So I pitched two ideas, and the one that I liked and the one that I wanted to do was Arise Serpentor Arise, where basically they decide they're going to make the supreme leader by getting the DNA of every great military leader in the past, putting them together and, creating this super warrior.
And that's how Larry's thing was too, right? Like, or I don't know if that seems like a crossover moment then. That he was like doing that in the comic book too to introduce Serpentor.
I think they indicated to him that was one of the paths that I was exploring. And,
interesting.
I don't know if they told him to do that, or if he thought, yeah, that's a good idea, I might as well do it. But in any case, I'm fairly certain. I'm not gonna argue. If anybody can prove that Larry came up with it first, I'll be happy to give credit. But I think I came up with it. But anyway, it doesn't matter. I presented two. The other one was that there is a hidden group somewhere that has been secretly funding Cobra all this time, and they are ticked off that Cobra Commander has bungled things, and they want to replace him. So I send this off to Hasbro, and they contact me and said, yeah, I would love it. Go ahead and do it. And I said, which one? And they said, both.
Oh, man.
So that puts the torpedo into the most dangerous man in the world idea, because even though I had written an outline at that point, if there is going to be a secret organization behind it all, you don't have room for a Cobra philosopher that, comes up with the original idea. So the most dangerous man in the world got pushed aside. Rise Serpentor Arise became the miniseries that introduces Serpentor. And at the same time this was going on, Ron Friedman had turned in a script for G.I. Joe the movie. They had passed on it. They sent the script to me and said, we're going to fly you to New York, and we want to talk with you about what do you think can be done to fix the script. And I literally read the script on the airplane en route to New York. And when we had the meeting, I said, I'm going to be honest with you, I would just at this point chuck the whole thing and start afresh. And they said, well, we were thinking that too. The only thing that they kept was Nemesis Enforcer, the winged guy. They liked him. Yeah, he's a good character. So, I mean, no begrudging to Ron here. Okay. It just the show, Ron had created the original Gestalt with the original miniseries. He was still working, I think, from that mindset, and had not realized how far afield we had gone from it by the time, because Ron's a busy guy. He doesn't have time to sit around and watch cartoons all day. Okay. He didn't realize how far afield we had gone from his original idea. So they said, well, come up with something, and we got to incorporate this secret group. And I said, well, okay, maybe there was a ancient civilization that, preceded humanity. And as humanity started covering the planet, they retreated into hiding. And now humanity, there's too much of us, and they've sent Cobra into the world to conquer humanity. And since Cobra has failed to conquer humanity, the next step is going to be to eliminate humanity by releasing these spores. And I had a lot of influence from various science fiction backgrounds. I mean, Larry Niven had created this concept called booster trees in his known universe stories. And a booster tree is essentially a plant that this alien species has cast the seeds around the galaxy. And it's a plant that grows up into a solid fuel rocket booster. So if you're trapped on a planet and you need to get off, you just cut down a bunch of these trees, strap them to your spaceship, and you're in orbit. There were ideas like that. I think Heinlein in Starship Troopers alluded to the fact that the things they were fighting did not use technological weapons. They used biological weapons. There were other examples of this. So I kind of mined all of those areas and came up with the idea that there would be this secret civilization that had, they were using biological creatures instead of, technical weapons and tools to do things. I remember we were discussing where this civilization could be hidden. And there was some reason why it couldn't be Antarctica. I think somebody had just done something set in Antarctica. There was another reason why it couldn't be a lost island in the Pacific. I may have vetoed the island in the Pacific, saying that just every island was pretty well charted by now. And the only place we could think of was, I said, possibly in the Himalayas, you could have a fake dome glacier, a fake glacier covering the civilization underneath. And as a placeholder name, I come up with the name Cobra-La, because I'm going, their legal department will recognize Cobra-La is clearly an allusion to Shangri-La, the most famous lost civilization in literature.
And that's the last time you did that.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I tell people, if you're going to use a placeholder name, never insert a placeholder name that you cannot live with. And I've got a work in progress right now. I just finished the first draft on it, and I've got a very mundane name for the community that the story takes place in. But at least if I can't come up with a better idea, I can at least live with this. I can go, it's not the greatest name in the world, but it's not embarrassing.
Springfield.
I tell people, if you're going to come up with a name, come up with something that absolutely can't be used, like Granny's Bawdy House, Hemorrhoid Island, something like that, something that absolutely cannot be used.
Sounds like the comments these guys make.
Yeah. So they loved Cobra-La. And I go immediately, no, you cannot use Cobra-La. Trust me, it's too similar to Shangri-La. It was only a placeholder. Give me some time. I'll think of something. No, we love it. And so they go with it. And to compound matters, okay, this is before we have cast any characters, okay? To compound matters, as I'm doing the script for the movie, I'm thinking, well, I'm stuck with Cobra-La. What can I do with it? And I remember this scene in the movie Lawrence of Arabia. Early on, a Bedouin tribe is using the women in the tribe as living air raid sirens. They are standing on the top of a mountain. They're keeping their eyes peeled for Turkish Air Force bombers coming at the tribe. And the moment they see the bombers on the way, they turn around and they have this incredibly high-pitched trilling sound that they make that can be heard for miles. And I thought, okay, that's what we can do with Cobra-La. We make it this incredibly high-pitched trill, Cobra, and it's supposed to be just piercing. and it becomes the battle cry. But they cast Dick Gautier as Serpentor. Dick Gautier, great actor, okay? I mean, really wonderful talent. Perfect for the job of Serpentor, not perfect for Cobra.
Unintentionally funny scenes in a movie.
8 octaves too low. And we're in the recording session, and he does it, and I go, whoa, stop. Don't do that. I said, give me 5 minutes, and I'll give you a better battle cry. Please, just give me 5 minutes. Nah, we like it. It's great. We'll go with it. Oh, jeez.
Oh,
yeah. And then they were
it's out of your hands at that point, right?
Yeah. They were going to now what they had done, if you've watched the show enough, if you're familiar enough with the show, they cycled characters and vehicles out and introduced new ones, from season to season. And typically we just wouldn't mention that a certain character was no longer being used. But on occasion, we would do something like, I think Sparks, who was the original Camo guy, Sparks pops up as a civilian in in season 2, who is contacted as a consultant for some technical problem. And we did that just to show that there was some kind of continuity going on. The Joes that stay in the alternate universe in Worlds Without End, they were Joes that were being cycled out of the toy line. So let them go be heroes in another parallel universe. Maybe they'll link up with Larry's guys. Okay,
that sounds very like Star Trek or something.
Yeah, so we let them go, and they were going to cycle out a whole batch of characters, including Duke, which we have since come to realize that was like a bad move. Duke is like one of the most popular characters ever in this show. But they were going to cycle Duke out. And I said, look, we have been doing a war show for 2 years and Lord knows how many miniseries at this point. And we haven't killed anybody. We've had people get injured, but we've never killed anybody. And if it's a war show, if Duke is going to be cycled out, let's kill him off. Let him die heroically. So that kind of shaped where the story was going. The whole subplot with Lieutenant Falcon and, Duke was supposed to die. Serpentor was supposed to kill him. They were releasing 3 Hasbro-related movies that year. My Little Pony, Transformers, and G.I. Joe. And they released them in that order because they thought it would build, that the My Little Pony audience would get people to come to the Transformers movie, would get people to come to the G.I. Joe movie. They later said, we made a mistake. We should have started out with Joe, which was the strongest of the bunch, and then Transformers, and then wrapped up the summer with My Little Pony. Okay, My Little Pony, so-so business, all right? Transformers does good business. But the problem is the Transformers audience were kids 9 to 12 years of age. Okay, that was the target range. G.I. Joe were kids 12 and over. And kids 12 and older intellectually understand the concept. People get hurt. People die in combat. Transformers, they're not quite there yet. They're not quite ready to embrace that idea. So you have all these parents taking their 9-year-old, 10-year-old kids to see the Transformers movie. And I can only imagine these poor parents, they're sitting there trapped for an hour and a half in a theater where it looks like a hallucination spoken in high Urdu. It's just like, what the hell is going on here? I don't understand any of this. And then all of a sudden, Optimus Prime dies and every kid in the place becomes hysterical. And we got reports. Got reports of kids locking themselves in closets, kids crying inconsolably for the rest of the movie. And there was this huge feedback from the parents. No, we don't want this. So they immediately said, we're going to redub the line and Duke will just be in a coma. And I'm going, no, we can get away with it with Duke. Just trust me on this. Kill him. Nope. So he's in a coma, and then he's out of the coma. There's a John Woo movie. I can't remember the name of it now. It Takes a Thief. I just remembered the name. There's a John Woo movie where Cho Yun-Fa and I forget the other 2 co-stars. They're a trio of thieves, and it's a romantic triangle. 1 gal, 2 guys, and they're a trio of art thieves who are stealing fabulous treasures all over the world. And it ends with a typical John Woo shootout where Cho Yun-Fa is like riddled with like 180, bullets.
And a lot of birds and doves are flying.
Yeah, but he's completely bullet riddled. And the other 2 members of the romantic triangle hold his dying body. And, he basically blesses them and tells them, be together and be happy. And then he dies. And test audiences hated that. And the producers told Woo, you've got to put a happy ending on it. And Woo said, you want a happy ending? I'll give you a happy ending. Reshoots the ending where just as Cho Yun-Fa is about to die, one of the other characters says, but if you die, who will babysit our children? And then they jump ahead several years in the future where Cho Yun-Fa in an apron is chasing around an apartment full of little kids. And there's just like slapstick comedy for a couple of minutes to show that he survived and he became a babysitter. And it's just like, all right, you want your happy ending? Here's your happy ending. I got your happy ending right.
So this was your version of Duke came out of his coma. Yeah.
I didn't write that line. I'm not sorry, write that line. They stuck it in on me, and it's just, geez. Yeah, I killed that son of a bitch deader than you can kill anybody.
Would it have been worse if you had a character say, "Oh shit, what are we gonna do now?" Like they did in Transformers the movie, or what's?
Well, see, that was the thing that I told them at the time. I said, death to a robot doesn't mean the same thing as death to a human being. You can crush a robot. You can run a steamroller over him. You can chop him into little tiny bits like they did at the end of Iron Giant, and you can always put him back together. You can always fix him, repair him. You can't do that with a living thing. And, just let it go. let him die. Anyway, and they also admitted they made a mistake in trying to introduce new characters. And this, for anybody who's doing a movie based on a TV show, the audience doesn't want to see new characters. The audience wants to see their old favorites doing stuff. Okay? Don't try to introduce major new characters. Just focus on the old characters. And that was one of the negative feedback we got on all three movies, in fact, that, we spent too much time with characters that nobody knew and at that moment cared about because they had paid their money to see the little ponies they loved or the Transformers they loved doing stuff that they wanted to see, not some other characters they didn't know about.
Yeah, and then when they killed Rainbow Pony in My Little Ponies, the parents just went through the roof.
Yeah. Well, they released the My Little Pony movie first. It did not do well. The Transformer movie was released and it had this big blowback. And Dino De Laurentiis, who was the distributor, had promised we would have 3 matinee shows on Saturdays and 2 matinee shows on Sundays. And instead, all he was able to deliver was 2 matinees on Saturdays and 1 matinee on Sunday. And Hasbro, just at that point backed out of the agreement. And G.I. Joe, the movie, was shown theatrically only twice. It was shown once at San Diego Comic-Con as a sneak preview. And it was shown once a couple of years ago at the Egyptian, the American Cinematheque. They did a special anniversary double feature of the Transformer movie and G.I. Joe, the movie. And I have to say, for a long time, I felt very uncomfortable about G.I. Joe, the movie. But when I saw it in a theater filled with fans who were there wanting to see it, the stuff that I used to cringe at a lot, I could bear with now. And the good stuff, I think, turned out pretty well. So I am no longer cringing.
In the theater. Wow.
Yeah, I think I would go see that double feature for sure. I'd pay a lot of anything.
Because the movie, I stumbled across that at a video store when they first released it. I was like, I didn't even know this was a thing until.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Wow.
I wanted to ask you, we don't want to keep you forever. We've already had you on for a long time. Just wanted to ask you a little bit about your relationship with Sergeant Slaughter.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Sarge is a cool guy.
This is my second mustache question of the day.
Yeah, you can't tell us apart in those old photos, can you? No, Sarge is a cool guy. His real name is Bob Remus, and he became interested in professional wrestling 5 to 10 years before he became Sergeant Slaughter. And he was a generic heel. He wrestled under the name Bob Slaughter for a long time, and he was basically going around from town to town getting beat up by the local hero. And, that's the journeyman stuff that you have to do when you're starting out as a wrestler. He got involved in what was then the WWF. I think it's the WWE now. He got involved in what was then the WWF, and they created this persona for him of Sergeant Slaughter. And you have to understand, this was at a time when Americans were very down on the military. We had just lost the Vietnam War. People were really sour on the military experience, very negative feelings about it. And they created Sergeant Slaughter to be the mean drill sergeant that everybody hated. And he was one of their biggest and best villains. And I don't know if you've ever seen it, but they gave him one of the greatest heel to hero turns anybody ever got in professional wrestling. They had the Iron Sheik, the Iron Sheik was actually like an Olympic contender, if not a champion, from Iran, who immigrated to the United States. And of course, there's no real wrestling, professional wrestling, I mean, in the sense of competitive wrestling.
Right.
And so he adopted the Iron Sheik persona. And when Iran seized the hostages, he becomes the favorite bad guy. He's out there waving the Iranian flag, and he's got the burnous on, and he's screaming insults and whatnot. And there was one televised event where he's come up and he's kicked the crap out of somebody, and he's screaming insults at the crowd. And he's coming down from the ring, and Sergeant Slaughter is standing there blocking his path. And instantly, blink of an eye, the Sarge went from the villain everybody hated to the hero everybody loved. And they did a series of matches that were I was watching professional wrestling at the time, and they did a series of matches that are among the best matches that anybody ever staged for pro wrestling. Later, when I got to work with him, he and his wife are delightful people. She told me this great story about how just before he became Sergeant Slaughter, he was going to be performing at a charity event. And they had two daughters, about 6 or 8. I don't know the exact ages, but in that age range. And the daughters were always asking Mom, he says, where does Daddy go every weekend? And he comes back all beat up. And they kind of recognize, well, we got to explain Daddy's a professional wrestler. And so he was going to wrestle in a local charity event. And because it was going to be a charity event, it wasn't going to be as bloody as one of the pro shows, yeah. So they're like, okay, well, this will be it. We'll take them in. We'll explain it's all play acting. Nobody's getting hurt. Well, they go to the event, and the older girl freaks out. That's her daddy up there getting hit repeatedly and slammed onto the mat. And she's freaking out. And the mother realizes, I got to get her out of here, grabs her and is going up the aisle and realizes she doesn't have the 6-year-old with her. And she turns to see where the 6-year-old is. And the 6-year-old is jumping up and down in her chair, screaming.
Oh, classic.
Yeah.
So how did he get involved in G.I. Joe, the show?
I am not 100% sure the exact way he got involved or his character got involved. I do know they had approached several sports celebrities at that time. Mm. The Refrigerator was briefly a member of G.I. Joe. Rocky Balboa was supposed to be a member of G.I. Joe, and then Stallone got greedy and sold the rights to Rambo to a competitor. And there's a G.I. Joe yearbook that has an addendum to it. We want to note that Rocky Balboa is not, never has been, and never will be a member of G.I. Joe.
I remember this.
Why was he in there?
Yeah.
Because I remember Sergeant Slaughter also did those live action wraparounds.
Yeah, the wraparounds. Yeah. That was another thing I got paid WGA money for. So
that's nice. Great.
Yeah, I was sad when they stopped running those because those were like Those were a handful of episodes to generate interest at stations that had not previously carried G.I. Joe. And they would offer them as, well, here's like our best episodes, and we'll let you have them for free, and you can show them to your audience. And if you get a good response, then maybe you'll want to, get the show from us. So that was what that was for. That was to generate interest in markets that they hadn't completely penetrated yet. And as long as they were running them, I was getting paid WGA money. So I was happy with that.
I feel bad for any kid that wasn't glued to the TV from 3 to 4 like I was watching G.I. Joe and Transformers Power Hour.
Yeah. Well,
I remember though, in like during the Gulf War, they made Sergeant Slaughter into a bad guy again, and like an Iraqi sympathizer and stuff, and that was like, that was kind of heartbreaking. I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah, they did weird stuff. I mean, I finally gave up on it. They had a talk show. Remember that? They had a 2-hour talk show that they did. That was just, it was basically no wrestling, just the guys coming out in character.
It was like a Johnny Carson kind of.
Yeah,
sort of.
I remember watching that, and I was amused by it. And then they did a segment where I can't remember if it was George the Animal Schultz or if it was Andre the Giant, where they were reprogramming his brain, and they obviously had just a metal colander with wires attached to it. And
yeah,
at that
it was
point,
George the Animal. You're right.
Yeah. At that point, I'm looking at it and I go, this. I'm a firm believer in what I call embrace the absurdity, and that is every story, even a realistic story. There's something absurd about it, that it just would not happen this way in real life. And what you have to do is you just have to recognize that and say, okay, we're going to roll with it. This is what this story is. And we're just going to pretend that this thing that obviously could not happen can happen. G.I. Joe, I mean, it's obvious. You're not going to be moving massive armies around in the blink of an eye. You're not going to be having explosions and cave-ins and all this without killing a lot of people. We'll just roll with it. Professional wrestling, up to that point, I'm going, okay, I'm willing to suspend my disbelief. I'm willing to suspend that there are these super partisan guys who these crazy characters who really believe and feel and act this way. For the duration of the match, I will suspend my disbelief. When they made that turn, that was like the moment I'm going, okay, now you've lost me. Now you have gone the step too far. Mind you, if you had started out at that level, I would have gone, okay, all right, fine. I accept this. I accept you've got, these guys that you can control their brains and you can do this and that and the other things, but you have to start at that level. It's kind of like the analogy of jumping the shark, which is a literal thing. Happy Days ran out of ideas, and one of the ideas was, well, let's have Fonzie jump a shark tank.
Yep.
Yeah, and then when you guys did Cubert, I was like, oh my god,
yeah.
Cubert
jumps the snake, or I guess.
Oh well, I mean, it got even worse than that. There was a animated show that Ruby Spears did the production on it, but Hanna-Barbera got the credit for it. That was basically, there was Laverne and Shirley in space with a pig, and Laverne and Shirley in the army with a pig, and then there was Happy Days in space
with a dog or something.
Yeah, and Mork and Mindy. We were doing Mork and Mindy, and I remember thinking, well, we got the best end of the deal, because Mork and Mindy, you got Robin Williams, you have in animation the ability to do off the wall stuff. We can actually make a Mork and Mindy animated show work. It's not going to look, we're not jumping the shark like the Laverne and Shirley and the Happy Days in space are jumping the shark.
Right.
And the editor that we had on it, I had written the script, and I had the Mork character giving an RRR pun, because if you remember the show, he would do RRR a lot.
Yeah.
And he made R&R puns in the show. How would you like a little R&R? RRR, that kind of thing. And I wrote this script, and he changed it to onk, onk, onk. And I said, no, it's not onk, it's R. It is very clearly an R sound. They're making jokes about it being an R sound. No, it's an onk sound. And I said, no, trust me, just watch a couple of episodes. It is an R sound. And he insisted on doing it his way. And Robin Williams was contractually obliged to do the voice because of the contract he signed to do Mork and Mindy. And he read the first couple of scripts, and he told Joe and Ken, he said, you send me all the scripts when they're ready to be recorded. I will record them in my home, and I will send you the tapes, and that's it. I will have nothing else to do with this show. And he literally recorded his voice tracks laying flat on his back in his bedroom in a cassette recorder.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and no direction, no nothing. He just read the stuff, read through them as quickly as he could. Not, he made sure he said the lines correctly, but he read them through and he sent them in, and nothing else to do with the show.
Wow. I'm sure the quality was excellent.
Oh yeah.
Jeez.
It's so difficult to do onk jokes
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Come up with a good
Yeah, but
onk.
then they're in the hospital. Well, it's an oncology joke.
All right, we don't want to keep you again. Like we said, we've taken up a lot of your time, and you're clearly a busy man because you are still working on you're writing constantly here. Is there anything?
Yeah.
You have a couple things here on your website that are forthcoming. They say novels and long form fiction. Do you want to hype those up a little bit or plug those or anything?
I will say this. I have one book ready to go, a young adult book, but I am holding off on it for a while. I'm kind of reevaluating my strategy, so to speak. I have just finished writing a satirical contemporary social satire, is the best way to describe it. It's a raucous version of Lake Woebegone would be the elevator pitch. But I've just finished the first draft on that. I'm going to let that lay fallow for a few weeks and then go back at it and trim it up. I tend to write longer and looser in my first draft because it's I'll repeat information, and when I'm going back, I don't have to say it this time. I've already said it, that sort of thing. But you just want to get it written down. You want to have it in place. So I'm going to give myself some time. I'm going to work on another project. I do these things called fictoids, and I actually do two different things called fictoids. One, you mentioned Instagram. On Instagram, I have every day I post a picture like of an old magazine illustration or an old advertisement.
I was wondering where you got those from.
Yeah,
just a Google search or something.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of websites that I follow, and then there's on Facebook. There's one website called Today's Inspiration that is no longer a public site because they got hit by spammers, and so they had to. You may be able to find it and ask if you can join, but they all focus on what is called mid-century advertising, or mid-century art, which is 1920s to 1975, which was kind of the golden age of magazine illustration. So there's a lot of that stuff, and I just, I find stuff and I put funny captions on them. I twist them around. There's one from some old pulp magazine where there's, the damsel in distress is strapped to a cart that's about to go into a fiery furnace. And she's saying, this is the worst Disneyland ride, and stuff like that. I mean, just silly stuff. Then I also do these short fiction pieces that come up every Tuesday on my blog site. And my blog is www.buzzdixon, BUZZDIXON.com. Buzz Dixon is all one word. And every Tuesday there's a short story that, it's a weird little take on something. One of my grandkids gave me a notebook that had at the top of it a writing prompt and a list of 10 words to include, and I took that as a challenge. Kind of cool. And so everyone is based on the writing prompt and the 10 words that had to be included in the story. And they're a lot of fun to do. I can blitz them out in about 10 or 15 minutes. And, if they don't turn out perfect, you go, well, okay, I learned something here. I won't do that again. But every now and then I go, well, I'll keep that in mind in the future. So that's every Tuesday, and I've got up through April of 2022 scheduled. There's a lot to see there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, all right. BuzzDixon.com. Check it out. I'm on there right now. It's a lot of great stuff on there. And some of those old advertising images are quite funny, actually. Again, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah,
it was great to talk to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we are fans. We've been trying, we've been thinking we want to do this for a long time. So this was.
Well, thank you.
great.
Thank you for having me on.
Fighting for freedom wherever there's trouble over land, sea, and air. Retreat! Retreat! G.I. Joe! G.I. Joe is there! G.I. Joe!
God damn Joe Blow!